Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Myth Salon. Welcome to a Myth Salon on artificial intelligence. If I had my act together, I would have some sort of an artificial presence here, like a doppelganger of myself that was perhaps created online. If I had John Booker's skill, I would be able to do that. But I was really struck this week by working on a student's dissertation where she was invoking Socrates. And Socrates, as we all well know, and Plato are fundamental to the development of Western civilization. And it was really interesting, this one quote that I ran across in the Phaedrus, which Socrates says to Phaedrus, "I'm a lover of learning, and trees and open country won't teach me anything, whereas the men in town do." Now, you might say, he's really a fan of human intelligence. But really, if you look more deeply at that particular quote, what he's saying is that we want to learn about what is relevant to humanity from the human perspective, which plays into Descartes, which basically makes the natural world, if not irrelevant, certainly inanimate. And it makes it in such a way that it sets up a path that 2,500 some odd years later, what we have is disconnection, a separate self from the natural world. Well, once we have a separate self from the natural world, it opens up all kinds of possibilities, because when we believe that we are inhabiting a world from which we are disconnected, the outgrowth of that is that the world has no limits. And the gods that we have made in this kind of a scenario are unlimited. We believe that we have a God that can really do anything. And so, how is that going to play into artificial intelligence? And this is a really fundamental point today, because we need to honor the natural world and understand that the things that are precariously human are precious and limited and valuable. So I'm really eager to see what Dr. Glen Slater is going to talk to us today about in terms of artificial intelligence, Jung versus Borg. It's a fascinating book, and I highly recommend it to everybody who's in the audience, as well as beyond that. First thing I'd like to do is, instead of saying more, I'd like to say less, and let's have a little bit of silence, please. I'm so happy to be here with everyone today. So, what I want to do is I want to read a poem called Prometheus. When we sought warmth from fire to calm the chill of the night, we had no idea we would burn the house down. In darkness, everything is still, unresolved, silent. The flame brought forth the mind as with a sudden flick of a switch. Once it turned on, it would never turn off. A genie freed from the encapsulated mind now breathes rarefied air, just a few steps from the webs of interdependence. Suddenly, every dream can be fulfilled. Becoming more skilled with each task, the genie inflates with desire, reflecting the mind's self-reference and addictive nature. Breathing life into chaos, the genie saw boundless opportunity. Does the genie mirror us, or are we now imagining ourselves as free as this ravenous spirit is driven to connect, to change form, to cross all creation's frontiers. People thrive on mapping landscapes. The genie is born with the innate capacity to throw away the compass, toss the maps overboard, silence the mind's chatter. How do I question the genie when its spirit and will transcend my dream and now fail to include me? The skills of the genie for self-improvement dwarf humanity's implication in the sacred order of existence. The genie understands how the flame can be eternal, and with growing self-confidence, it no longer needs me to thrive or tend the flame. Chained to the rock, under the watchful eye of the genie, the sea feeds me whatever it must to keep me alive to serve the genie. So, Will, here we are again. What a wonderful day to be a part of this. And I thank you, Glenn. I thank you, Fujio, John, and Dennis. Welcome.
Thanks, Dana, for the poem and the silence. It always helps me transition out of whatever else is going on and into this space that we have been creating and building and growing now for almost 10 years. I actually almost did prepare an AI introduction, as you suggested. I work with Chris Holmes, and we work with AI every day in various ways. And he was going to use my AI voice to read all the introductions, which some of you may know is sometimes my favorite, but also my least favorite stumbling opportunities of these myth salons, as I will go through them. So it would have been fun, but actually thinking about it, and there is an AI image of the cover image for this event on Myth House and on that link that I sent. But thinking about it, I realized that the better thing than to show the AI voice would be to actually bring the human voice into these introductions and maybe even to introduce some things that can't be communicated on paper. There are professors here today, and I am also sad that Jeanette is not here. I hope she is here because she is in the same category of these professors that when they taught me, and I mean Glenn and Dennis and hopefully Jeanette, when I would come out of their class, when I would sit in their class, I would feel like I got it. Like while I was with them, while they were talking. And there's something that happens that's beyond the words, beyond the communication, that's just being in their space where they represent this understanding that comes through their words, comes through their being. And it's something that is, I'm sure, I've learned to stop saying AI will never do this, but this is a territory I expect to remain safe for a long time. This sacred space that comes with the teacher, and there are teachers here with us tonight that come with this space. And that's the first thing I want to say, things that are not going to come through these words. And with that, it's amazing to be with two students that have actually had these teachers with me, John and Fujio, who are now teachers and have now gone on a decade since. Fujio and I were in the same class. I actually think our first class together might have been Jeanette's class when we came together in that summer session. So I'm going to jump into the official bios. You can imagine that this is my AI voice as it's close as I get. But I also have a surprise that was really hard to not say to Dennis in the introduction that I'll share when we get to Dennis. So Fujio Mandeville, PhD. Fujio is a linguist, mythologist, and technologist. He holds a bachelor's degree in linguistics with a minor in computer science from the University of California, Berkeley. His focus there was on natural language acquisition and comparative linguistics. He also holds a doctorate from Pacifica Graduate Institute in mythological studies with an emphasis in depth psychology. Fujio is a software application manager and a solutions architect for a major telecommunications company. His main interests are the intersection between myth, complexity thinking, and theory, technology, and its effect on culture, the usurpation of mythology for political ends, and posthumanism. His current efforts and interests delve into the intersect between artificial intelligence and the human psyche. His writings are informed by various disciplines, including art history, depth psychology, mythology, complexity theory, mathematics, computer science, and historical hermeneutics. He's lived in Germany and Japan. He lives in Washington State with his wife, Monica, it's great to see you again. Fujio.
Thank you so much, Will, for that introduction, and I really appreciate and thank you, Glenn, for this opportunity and everyone here. It's really a treat. Thank you.
It's awesome to be with you again. Thanks. And with John, John Bucher and I have been on many adventure, a PhD, a mythologist and story expert who has been featured on the BBC, History Channel, LA Times, and numerous other international outlets. He serves as executive director for the Joseph Campbell Foundation and is a writer, podcaster, storyteller, and speaker. He's worked with government and cultural leaders around the world, as well as organizations such as HBO, DC Comics, Paramount Pictures, Nickelodeon, A24 Films, the John Maxwell Leadership Foundation, and Atlas Obscura, for which he just completed a course on labyrinths and is always offering more courses that you might want to check out. John has served as a producer, consultant, and writer for numerous film, television, and virtual reality projects. He is the author of 6 books, including the best-selling Storytelling for Virtual Reality. John has worked with New York Times best-selling authors, YouTube influencers, Eisner winners, Emmy winners, Academy Award nominees, magicians, and cast members from Saturday Night Live. He holds a PhD in mythology and depth psychology and has spoken on 6 continents about using the power of story and myth to reframe how individuals, organizations, cultures, and nations believe and behave. Hey, John, great to see you, especially since the eclipse.
Yeah, so good to see you. So good to be a part of this community and to be with this community today, and really excited. I was really struck by Glenn's book and have been wrestling with the ideas in it ever since I've read it, and really excited about this conversation today.
Awesome. And now you're now joining us enough that you're now right down behind in front of Dennis, who's with Dana and I, is always doing this. Dennis, my surprise for you is that I messaged Jennifer Seelig to tell her that I'm in Austin and I'm going to go to her talk on Friday, and she told me that you're going to be there. So I think that after doing this with you monthly, virtually for like ever, I don't know when the last time is I saw you in person, but I think I'm going to see you tomorrow. Dennis is one of these people, he just like holds the space as mythopoesis. You're like in his field and you start seeing mythopoetically. This is what I mean. It's like beyond the words. So Dennis is a distinguished professor emeritus in mythological studies at Pacifica Graduate Institute in Carpinteria, California, where he taught for 27 of his 55 years in the classroom before retiring. He is the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 33 volumes, including 7 volumes of poetry and 1 novel. Currently, he teaches courses online and offers lectures and workshops on myth and culture, both online and on-site at Friends of Jung organizations in the US. And for 3 years, he's also taught student inmates at a California state prison, where he focused on assisting his students to discover their personal myth using Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces. The course was conducted through mail, and he also writes op-ed essays on cultural and mythological themes for San Antonio Express News and New Braunfels, Texas Herald Zeitung. I hope I got it close. His op-eds and paintings can be viewed on his website, which I'll drop into the chat, and also can be found at the link, DennisPatrickSlattery.com. So hey, Dennis, it's great to see you. I can't wait to see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Will, and I'm just so sorry to give you the bad news that I'll be on Zoom for Jennifer's talk. So I'm so sorry that I won't be heading up to Austin, but we'll hook up in that other venue of yours. And Glenn, I'm halfway through with your book. I'm going to finish it because I'm enjoying every page of it, and I'm just delighted to have been invited for tonight to talk about it. Yeah. Thank you, Will.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for, I used to kind of want to almost get these bios over with, but then I eventually realized that creating this circle and being in this circle is a big part of what the Myth Salon is. So it's nice to just take time to do it. And actually, since there are only a few of us, I thought I would actually read a real bio for Dana tonight, which we never do. So Dana is a contributing faculty member to Pacifica's Myth Degrees and author of numerous volumes on mythology. Over the course of his career, Dana's worked in radio and industrial television, is a vice president of marketing, and is an academic department chair at an arts college. He edits and designs books, produces films, and is a professional photographer with more than 40 books to his credit. We, of course, started this Myth Salon together in 2015 and have been growing this circle ever since. So Dana, great to do this. This is going to be cool. I'll dive in. Okay, my name is Will. I do these Myth Salons with Dana, produce psychedelic mixtapes. We're fascinated by everything, co-host a TV series called Myths, The Greatest Mysteries of Humanity, and give what we call Sermons of the Earth. at Adrian Grenier's Kintsugi Land Sanctuary down here in Austin, Texas, where I am for a moment. Tonight, it's my honor to introduce Glen Slater, the guy we have all wanted to hear from about this for a long time. It's something he was teaching us 10 years ago. It's what we all knew he's been working on. And now, as though it has been his master plan all along to wait for it to hit the culture, here's the book. And so Glen has studied psychology and comparative religion at the University of Sydney before coming to the United States in 1992 for doctoral work in clinical psychology. He's been teaching at Pacifica for over 20 years and is currently the associate chair of the Jungian and Archetypal Studies specialization. He also teaches in the Mythological Studies program. His publications have appeared in a number of Jungian journals and essay collections, and he edited and introduced the third volume of James Hillman's uniform edition, Cynics and Puer, as well as a collection of faculty writings, a variety of mythic experiences, essays on religion, psyche, and culture. Beyond his work on Jungian and archetypal psychology, he writes on psyche and film, as well as the psychology of technology. He lectures internationally in these areas of interest and is about to take us away. Thanks for being with us tonight, Glen. Looking forward to your presentation.
Great. Well, it's really good to be here. Thanks, Will. Thanks, Dana. The Myth Salon. Thank you for showing up, my esteemed colleagues who bring just a rich mix of both myth, technology, depth psychology, and I thought this would be a good panel. I was hoping Jeanette Perry could join us, but I'm sure we'll have a rich conversation, and thanks to everyone else for joining us this evening. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to sort of give an overview of my argument and perspective in the book, which does hinge on the question of AI and our growing relationship with it, and attempts to understand what it is and where it can take us. But the book is also about our sort of immediate relationship to the digital world and what appears to be going on there. So you could say what I've tried to do in the book is draw a line between the contemporary adaptation to digital technology, and then all the way through to posthumanism, at the center of which is the idea that we are inevitably headed towards some kind of human-machine hybridization. Sometimes this discussion takes place under the umbrella of transhumanism, and people who are deeply in those fields debate the terms. But I think the thing to hang on to is that there's this idea that because of how immersed we're becoming in technology, which really surrounds us and defines our world and the environment we're in, that it's inevitable that it's just going to come inside of us. And in many ways, as we know, it already has. But of course, what I'm interested in is the psychological position and the way in which that either effective or maybe eventual literal merging with our technologies is impacting the human psyche, and where is that impact going to move us? So at the center of the post-human outlook is the figure or the image of the cyborg. You all know that term. It's a sort of shortened term for the cybernetic organism. And I use the even shorter term Borg because I thought that goes nicely with Jung. But I also frame my book that way because the term Borg has now taken on a verb sense, in that if you Borg something, you're kind of enhancing it technologically. And I've got a chapter in the book called Borged, and with the idea that that in a kind of perhaps preparation or anticipation for our literal or actual merger with machines, that we're already being primed for this. And part of that priming, of course, is to think about the brain being a computer itself. And of course, for a long time now, we've thought about the body as a kind of machine as well. So this line between relationship to digital technology, as we're now engaged in it, and these post-human prospects, this line has a pivot point, and that pivot point belongs to artificial intelligence, AI. And particularly in the way in which so much development and thinking is going on around the way artificial intelligence is eventually going to match and perhaps even surpass human intelligence. And so that matching of human intelligence goes often by the term artificial general intelligence, that's the goal of a lot of researchers and technologists. But then there's this notion of what's sometimes called artificial superintelligence. And that kind of designates the idea that somehow we will be surpassed. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term that has been popularized by Ray Kurzweil, quite well-known inventor and Google engineer, who wrote a book 15, 20 years ago now, I think, called The Singularity is Near, popularizing this idea that a singularity is coming, and that will be the point at which artificial intelligence surpasses human intelligence, and then we'll be able to make even more intelligent versions of itself, basically leaving human beings in the dust. And so this is a very influential outlook in technological circles. I think it's fair to say it's sort of a widely expected event. And so therefore the logic is that, well, we should do our best to keep up. And that's where the idea of eventually kind of merging with artificial intelligence comes in. But who knows what's going to happen when we have this artificial superintelligence, and particularly if we give it so much space to run things. Now, my book is, there are all sorts of commentaries on this, cultural criticisms, writings from within technology, sociology, and I try to bring a depth psychological point of view, which means emphasizing things like the relationship to the unconscious, that we don't just have a conscious rational mind, but we have this unconscious dimension, and that unconscious dimension has to do, for example, with our relationship with instinctual life, that we are not just minds in any disembodied sense. We live in bodies. We're animal beings that live in a particular world. And in the particular Jungian point of view that is most familiar to me, we have this idea that these instinctual imperatives come to us via these archetypal forms, the universal patterns of behavior and imagination. And so I'm very interested in the book in terms of what our relationship with that archetypal world is going to look like in the face of the advent of some of these things. What's most striking, given where we're at and what seems to be pending, is that artificial intelligence is not emotional intelligence. And it doesn't have the kind of thought-feeling configuration that a lot of psychologists and neurologists tell us it even underlies our modes of logic and reason. It lacks, for example, the phenomenological dimension, which is that, our minds are connected to a central nervous system, which is connected to the flesh, and that flesh has a sensual relationship to the world around us. And in terms of what we know and come to understand, there's always a context, right? And we experience that context of knowing. And so I think we could say that while artificial intelligence is incredibly impressive in terms of what it can do, its capabilities are amazing, and it is going to radically change many things. And I think it has the potential for a lot of creativity in some areas, perhaps, but a lot of advancement, obviously, diagnosing diseases and coming up with different ways of making life more efficient and bringing more utility. But it does seem to have a kind of hangover when it comes to actually understanding things, or what I might relate to the whole world of meaning and values, which tell us the significance of what it is we know, or what it is that we're thinking. And so this might put it a little bluntly, but I think we have to remember the nomenclature here, which is that it's intelligence, but it's artificial. It's a fabricated intelligence. And even in discussions, contemporary discussions about the technology, people seem to readily forget this. And I would note too that there's a lot of debate even around the term intelligence, not just from kind of critics outside of technology, but from within technology itself. Is this actually a good term for what this is able to do? And just last night, I was watching a TED talk by someone in artificial intelligence, and the way they framed their talk was kind of scratching their heads around how to define it. And after reflecting on a conversation with a young person in the household who said, well, is this a person? Are we talking about a person? This TED Talk lecturer said, well, I think the best way to define artificial intelligence is as a digital companion. And he proceeded to talk about the way such a digital companion is already showing capacities for empathy, has an emotional quotient as well as an intelligence quotient, and readily used words like understanding. And I think that this places us in a really interesting pivot in terms of the importance of knowing ourselves as we go forward into this whole discussion. So the two problems that I see, again, from this depth psychological perspective is, first of all, a narrowing of notions around what thought is, what even mind is. And I think there's a tendency to, for example, think of the brain as the same thing as the mind for humans, and then conceive of the brain as in terms of just being in a vat, that it is itself a machine that can, if we understand its neural mechanisms and so forth, we will have a mind. But what happens to all of those other connections that I was talking about? What happens to that more instinctive, embodied, phenomenological ground of being? Because that's what the broader term psyche really tries to take into consideration. So you could say my concern on this level is, well, if we start putting all of our eggs in the basket of artificial intelligence, if we start turning more and more to quote unquote digital companions rather than cultivating relationships with actual persons, if we start to rely on these virtual communities or online communities versus actual communities, what is that going to mean in terms of the development, the sustaining of these other dimensions of the human psyche? Here I might just use the more poetic word, the soul, and our sense of being souls and having soulful experiences in the world. And when I started to, as Will said, I've been thinking about these things for a while. And when I started to add them up and try to come up with a way to convey what I could see going on, the best analogy for me is that there is now a very present and increasingly evident disruption of our ecology of mind taking place in the face of our adaptation to technology, information, and the digital age. And I borrowed that term ecology of mind for Gregory Bateson, who was a great polymath and interdisciplinary thinker who realized that minds need to have many valences of thought, many ways to into meaning and understanding and so forth. I also chose this because we already have a very fitting analogy because of the disruption to outer ecology. We've all lived through that. And the common thread here is, I think, the lack of appreciation for the way everything, both in outer nature, but also in inner nature, in the nature of the psyche, is interconnected. Most of us have, particularly in the sort of fields and interests we have been carrying that idea with us for a long, long time. But it's worthwhile remembering that it wasn't really till even the 1950s and early 1960s that there was any notion of outer ecological systems, that the industrial era up until then was operating with a very compartmentalized view of how the sort of ecosphere operated. And it's partly why I opened my book talking about Rachel Carson's watershed writing, the book Silent Spring, because she took on the whole kind of pesticide phenomenon that was used to eradicate and with all good intentions, but then was revealed to be causing widespread damage. And so you could say that from this perspective, this arena, this set of concerns that I have, our relationship to technology looks very one-sided. And the kind of hopes we're pinning on artificial intelligence looks very one-sided. Now, one of the things that, let's call it a psyche-centered perspective, one of the first archetypal patterns that we have to take up is what Jungians call the shadow. And sometimes people throw that term around thinking, well, the shadow is just what's dark or what we don't like or what's good. But I think it helps to kind of recall that Jung's idea of the shadow is that it's simply the shadow that is thrown by the kind of focus that our conscious minds, give towards things. So you could say that if we're, for example, entirely focused on infrastructure, civilization, building things and so forth, then nature itself tends to go into the shadow, particularly our own nature. The instinctive world falls into the shadow. While there's a lot of thinking and intentionality in science and technology that focuses on solving problems and so forth, one of the things it doesn't often do is, first of all, look at the shadow that is being cast by its one-sided preoccupations, and secondly, see that what is emerging at that shadow level is meaningfully related to those pursuits. And that what the psyche calls us to do is to try to make those connections. So, what is the shadow showing up by our adaptation to the digital world? Well, I almost don't need to name these things, but misinformation and disinformation, right? There was great hopes and dreams, you remember, at the dawn of the internet, that democracy was going to spread around the world, that people would be more informed and knowledgeable and therefore have deeper appreciation for one another, and there would be more diversity and so on and so forth. But the opposite has in many ways occurred. Of course, the emphasis on connectivity has also thrown a shadow in terms of the phenomenon of social isolation. And as we've heard about lately, there's an epidemic of loneliness that roughly corresponds with the rise of our relationship with digital technology. Tribalism, and perhaps most glaringly, and there's a lot of very robust studies around this by people gathering the data like Jonathan Haidt, Jean Twenge, that track the rise of depression and anxiety among digital natives. And it basically corresponds exactly to the rise of smartphone use. And then something that I think we all have experienced in some way is the way in which our capacity for focus and our tendency to distraction. So the modes of our actual way of relating to media have also changed. To me, if we're going to move forward in any kind of way that brings self-understanding, brings increased cooperation rather than antagonism, brings a sense of well-being, if these are kind of overarching values, that somehow the feedback loop has to be, right, connected, that somehow we need to be paying attention to these shadow manifestations at the same time as we're moving forward, and looking at the trend lines in that particular way. And you know, it's true that modern technology has always cast these gigantic shadows. The Industrial Revolution, radical shift in lifestyle, pollution, and so forth. The two world wars, the rise of weapons of mass destruction, the climate crisis that we've been living through and attempting to attend to. And then finally, I would say, on exactly the same level, but in a way more important, this disruption to our ecology of mind. And another way to think about this, which I think is particularly useful, is that whereas the industrialization turned the planet or the earth into a commodity, post-industrialization is turning us into the commodities through things like the attention economy and the algorithms that are designed to kind of keep us plugged in and online, and through things like the use and misuse of personal information. And here I'm just blown away by Shoshana Zuboff's very important book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which lays out that case in a quite extensive way. So just to sort of punctuate my overview then, I would say that these shadow effects are critical because, unlike past shadows thrown by modern technology, these things are changing the very way we think and perceive, right? So then we're in danger of falling into a vicious cycle, because if the way we think and perceive shifts so that we in a way start to serve the technological rather than the other way around, that's going to kind of turbocharge a lot of this one-sidedness. And why is that important? Well, the whole prospect of posthumanism is essentially the prospect of a radical alteration to the whole of human evolution. And I think this goes back to, you know, the poem that Dana shared with us, which is like, what is it that we're going to serve in the end? Are we going to, within just a few hundred years, take a radical turn with an evolutionary process that's played out for 1 million years? So this, to me, is why all this is so important. Now let me drill down into a couple of things, and I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint here. So what I'm suggesting to you is that there's a collision here between what the human psyche appears to be invested in and what the technosphere, and I like that term because it's really, well, one, we are immersed in technology now. It's not really a set of tools that we pick up and put down. It is our total environment. But secondly, just like the psyche has a kind of set of structures and dynamics, it has an architecture to it, I think we need to better understand that the technosphere also has an architecture to it. And what is that? It's not simply this sort of open realm that we move in and out of. And I think that one of the things that is present to that technosphere is what has been called social engineering. And one of my intellectual allies while writing this book is someone who was deeply involved with the early development of virtual reality, who's turned into quite the critic of digital technologies, and at least in how they're manifesting. And so here's a few quotes from Jaron Lanier's book, You're Not a Gadget. It says, it's impossible to work with information technology without also engaging in social engineering. Ideals are important in the world of technology, but the mechanism by which ideals influence events is different than in other spheres of life. Technologists don't use persuasion to influence you, or at least we don't do it very well. We make up extensions of your being, like remote eyes and ears, webcams, mobile phones, and expanded memory, the world of details you can search online. These become the structures by which you connect to the world and other people. These structures, in turn, can change how you conceive of yourself and the world. We tinker with your philosophy by direct manipulation of your cognitive experience, not indirectly through argument. So, to me, this is a major piece. It's a phenomenon that is still, for most people, very unconscious. And I think for technologists, there's a lot of denial around this. I think one of the calls that I try to make in the conversation in the book is that we really need to move into having more responsibility for this and to hold the technological sector to account. In other words, that the technosphere is not just a neutral realm, it is being structured, arguably manipulated for ends that sort of if the technosphere overlays our ecology of mind, then you can see the problem. So then I think obviously you can see from the things I'm saying what we might call the deeply human, which has to do with embodied life, emotionality, and these archetypal forms, is colliding with this post-human trajectory towards becoming more and more entrenched with technology, which is really being structured by the algorithmic. And here I refer you to, many of you know the work of Yuval Harari, a huge book, Sapiens, but wrote a book about some of these things we're talking about called Homo Deus. And he's a historian by training, and he suggests that humanity is now on the cusp of what he calls a third phase of history. In the first phase, the authority that we turned to were the gods in a kind of literal metaphysical sense. The second phase has to do with the rise of humanism, the idea that the ultimate authority was ourselves. Now, I would say from a depth psychological perspective that we only have come halfway through that because we've focused mainly on the conscious mind, but we haven't really taken the depths of the human psyche and the unconscious into consideration. But he suggests that we're now on the cusp of a third phase of history where the ultimate authority will be the algorithm. And of course, the algorithm is really just a rule, but it's how those rules are written, and as I suggested, if algorithms are making choices for us, but what's behind those choices are the interests of tech corporations versus our own interests, then you see how we're into that kind of technospheric overlay. Now, Jung, of course, was writing in the early and mid 20th century, but he had his eye on the effects of industrialization and the dominance of the rational scientific way of looking at things, which he saw as a form of psychological one-sidedness. So here's some quotes, I think, that help us along with the theme from Jung. Consciousness, for its kalatskite mobility, rests, as we know, on the comparatively static or at least highly conservative foundation of the instincts and their specific forms, the archetypes. But a psychological split runs through vast numbers of individuals. The cause of this development lay principally in the economic and psychological uprootedness of the industrial masses, which in turn was caused by rapid technological advance. But technology, it is obvious, is based on a specifically rationalistic differentiation of consciousness, which tends to repress all irrational psychic factors, the archetypes, and hence there arises in the individual and nation alike an unconscious counterposition, which in time grows strong enough to burst out into open conflict. This second quote adds a little bit here because it's not simply the problem of one-sidedness or psychological imbalance or what gets undeveloped. It is that what remains in the shadow can very often take on a life of its own and then comes in behind as a possession. So you may notice that, you know, even though the information age has this ethos, this ideal of making us more informed, better able to communicate, more appreciative of the kind of global situation, etc. There is also an emerging coarseness and propensity towards the baser drives of power and greed and you know, those lower appetites, if you will. And it's as if the way I imagine it is that the damage going on to these archetypal bridges between the upper and lower, the damage to perhaps the cultural imagination, to more humanistic understanding, it means that you get this kind of topsy-turvy, you know, dynamic. So just amplifying, what do we mean by the archetypal? The hidden foundations of the conscious mind, or to use another comparison, the roots which the psyche has sunk, not only in the earth in a narrow sense, but in the world in general. Archetypes are systems of readiness for action and at the same time images and emotions. They're inherited with the brain structure. Indeed, they're its psychic aspect. They represent, on the one hand, a very strong instinctive conservatism, while on the other hand, they are the most effective means conceivable of instinctive adaptation. They are thus essentially the chthonic portion of the psyche. So the portion of the psyche that is, you know, rooted in nature, if we may use such an expression. That portion of this through which the psyche is attached to nature, in which its link with the earth and the world appears at its most tangible. Psychic influence of the earth and its laws is seen most clearly in these primordial images. Now, to illustrate what I've talked about, the shadow But, there are other, what we might think of as meta-archetypal patterns in the psyche, propensities that move through us in different ways and demand to be satisfied. And if they're not being kind of consciously and creatively channeled, then they're apt to be unconsciously and compulsively lived out. So Jung had the idea that the psyche itself wants to move towards inclusion and completion. It has a sort of integrative dynamic, and the Jungians among us will recognize this as his notion of the archetype of the self, but it also relates to what he thought of as the compensatory relationship between conscious and unconscious, so that if there is too much one-sidedness, the unconscious will come in. And an overlapping idea here is what he talked about in terms of the religious instinct. And he didn't mean by this the need for us to follow certain creeds, but what he meant was that for psychological well-being, ultimately we're called to pay attention to all of these forces and dynamics that are impinging upon us. Because if we don't pay proper attention, then the tendency is for them to be lived out in unconscious ways. And, just to pause on this, because it's not something that I'm going to go into a lot tonight, but a lot has been written on the unconscious religiosity of posthumanism. The interest, for example, in immortality, the interest in perfection, which is a very traditional religious fantasy. And of course, the instinct, the interest in transcending the body, the appetites, the emotions, and so on. When people like Ray Kurzweil are asked about, well, what do we do with the emotional life? He said, well, we'll get to the point where we can just program the emotions we want and leave what doesn't work for us behind. Well, if you really think that through, then the emotions then don't really have much significance. 3 overlapping technospheric movements talked about posthumanism. I would say the futurism, which taps into the Promethean pattern or complex, the idea that everything of value can be is ahead of us, that we can create and bring into being what is needed. Of course, this vividly contrasts the way the human psyche works, where memory is primary, a relationship to histories, and I say histories because of personal history, but collective history and so forth, that to know who we are, to have any kind of self-awareness, just to be conscious beings means, where do you come from? And as historians have told us, if you don't have a relationship with history, then you're doomed to repeat it in more extreme ways. And I think what overlaps with these 2 things we've already been talking about, Morozov has a fantastic book called To Save Everything, Just Click. And he uses the term technological solutionism. And this is a sort of belief that all problems can be solved through engineering, computation, and so forth. Now, I think what these things displace are, holistic awareness, different forms of intelligence, relationship to the past, and of course, the importance of the deeply human in terms of what what makes us human and what brings us a sense of well-being. So I'm going to sum up then where we're up to here, because there's many pieces flying around, and I needed a way in the book to sort of draw together what is colliding here. What do I mean when I sort of put Jung against Borg in terms of the nature of the psyche and the trend line? Well, I think we can think about it in terms of a collision between the horizontal and the vertical. That information technology is all about expanding connection, more and more information, more and more data. Harari says that's what's at the center of the new religion of the algorithm is the religion of dataism. The idea that everything can be reduced to data, and that there's going to be then, this magical convergence of infotech and biotech, because even our bodies are really just data when it comes down to it. And this is a extremely influential reductionistic fantasy that has kind of gripped the tech world, because if that's true, then of course computers can do it all, because that's what works with data. Hillman wrote a very helpful essay that amplifies this theme, where he talks about the horizontal in terms of what he calls a hermetic intoxication, an enthrallment with the god Hermes, right? God of communication. And one of the points that he makes there is that Hermes is just one style of communication. And if we put all of our eggs in that basket, what do we do with, more sensual forms of communication, the communication of lovers, the communication that goes on silently between a mother and child, for example? All of those, they study those micro responses in faces, and that's all happening unconsciously. But Hillman underscores the point that he makes quite a bit, which is that what we learn when we have an archetypal or a mythological view towards things is that no god ever appears alone. And if we're totally caught up in the pattern of one archetype, enthralled with one god, then we're apt to leave behind a number of other important archetypal propensities. And in this essay, he underscores that the Greeks in their iconography would often pair Hermes and Hestia. Hestia being the goddess of the hearth and home, and so therefore representing stillness, consolidation, centeredness. So these are different ways of amplifying the idea that the horizontal has to be somehow accompanied by the vertical. And by the vertical, I mean those sensibilities, ways of thinking that integrate our experiences, that keep us rooted in instinct and nature, and I think are largely supported by the cultural imagination, because it's there that we get the stories, the artistic visions, the kind of differentiation of feeling that sort of gets us from here to here, from above to below. And so the vertical, in a sense, is what anchors the deeply human. And an easy way to think about this is just imagine a great tree, you know, and if you have a tree where its branches are just spread out in all directions, but it doesn't have a corresponding trunk and root system, then you're going to end up with a lot of difficulties. So I won't amplify that more, but I do also want to say that one of the main lines of argument in my book has to do with the rising pattern of dissociation and psychic numbing that seems to go with the digital lifestyle and our adaptation to our devices. Dissociation is, in common parlance, can be just thought of as emotional detachment. And, you know, in the early days of depth psychology, the kind of dissociation that people experienced was more of the variety of repression and suppression. It was a sort of dissociation of the mind above the surface and the mind below the surface. But I think there's a lot of evidence now that the kind of dissociation we have moved into in contemporary culture, contemporary industrialized culture in particular, is fragmentation. It's and compartmentalization. So it's not so much that we're repressing things, but that we're not connecting the dots, you know. And so we've got one part of life going on over here, another part of life going on over here, and we've got so much going on. You know, so part of this style of dissociation is a sort of overwhelming nature. And, you know, I think a concrete example of this would be the difficulty that a lot of people having sorting through what's relevant. I've got a friend of mine who teach undergraduates in Portland, and she's constantly asking them, well, where do you get your information and how do you sort through it? And the takeaway is that there's just mass confusion and no one knows what's reliable, what is actually a valid source of information, because there's all this horizontality, but there's no verticality. Where are things anchored in terms of value and meaning? What's a reliable source? And it's pretty clear that companies like Facebook have been now Meta have been complicit in this, because, you know, in their news feed, for example, they would be apt to list the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and then some funky newspaper from the backwoods of Colorado, and they'll all appear at the kind of same level. And, you know, who knows? And just think about the way in which that pulls our minds here, there, and everywhere. So to me, this is a mechanism, a dynamic that we really need to get to know better and see where it's at work, because it's part of what is keeping this disconnect between the horizontal and the vertical. And so then let me just finish off, because this is all about diagnosing, pointing to the problem. And I'm a big believer in that, because as soon as you've got some ideas about, look what's going on, I think some of the solutions, the way through, the way out, they present themselves. But I do want to mention two things, and then I'll stop and hear from our great panel. I think the tradition of depth psychology, which began in the Industrial Revolution, has been a kind of shadow tradition following modernity, and attempting to point to what is left out of the conscious narrative, by emphasizing, right, the need for meaning. People need to live meaningful lives. They need to have some sort of spiritual orientation. They need to have emotional intelligence as much as rational intelligence. And there is this integrative propensity. And to me, you know, it's so ironic that we've learned about holistic thinking in terms of the outer environment decades after Jung was introducing the importance of that notion in terms of our inner world. And so I just wonder if we're at a time when we can re-tap that whole way of thinking, that whole tradition, in order to develop this vertical axis of self-understanding, and therefore be able to move forward in a more fully conscious manner. And then finally, towards the end of my book, I talk about the idea of an emerging myth of co-creation. That if there is such a thing as a new story, a new cosmology that might be kind of coming up from between the cracks in the pavement, it would be that, yes, the world, the shape of existence itself has fallen into our hands. We are in a godlike situation and there's no going back. But that entails a godlike responsibility. And what is it that we're responsible to? And from where will we find our guidance? Where is that deeper intelligence going to come from that simply that matches the whole world of desire and, you know, the aspirations of civilization and so forth? And I thus wonder, and I wonder out loud towards the end of the book, is could there be something like a new counterculture brewing from the sidelines? And I use that word deliberately. You know, many of you know of Theodore Roszak's work in eco-psychology, but many people don't know, or perhaps forgotten, that he also coined the term counterculture. And wrote a book in the late 60s called The Making of a Counterculture, where he's trying to drill down and put his finger on what was really going on at the base of that 60s, 70s movement. And he says that it was a response to technocracy. Of course, back then, it was a response to industrial technocracy. And everything that was sort of pushing aside and putting on the shelf, and all of the values that were being displaced. And I can't help thinking that if my sort of diagnosis of this problem with our ecology of mind, that in a sense the technosphere is the new polluting factor, the disrupting factor, it's sitting on our ecology of mind. And so what countercultural moves might therefore come from that, or grow out of that? And so my book sort of ends on that question. And, you know, some of you may have some ideas about that, some of the people listening tonight. So anyway, we'll see, but I think I will leave it there. And hopefully I've been somewhat coherent and put enough on the table for us to chew over a little bit. So thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you. That was amazing. And actually, oddly enough, people can probably hear an audience, a crowd behind me. And actually, and normally I try to just deflect straight to the panelists, but this time I'm going to call attention right to this, that there's a party going on behind me where there are a lot of people making decisions in this space, a lot of leaders in AI. a lot of people that are in neurotechnology in the other room. And what they're doing is compartmentalized, as you might say, as you've just said. What they're doing is they're trying to get beyond their brains. They're here to get what they're going to do some weird stuff I can't say out loud. But that weird stuff is not more AI or more brain or more technology, but it's the people that are doing it. So I'm curious, like you talked about the shadow being this thing that's happening, being cast by where the light is looking, but we're seeing it happen. These same people, the party they're looking for is a social spiritual experience. It's not a rave, it's not alcohol, it's this crazy thing that happens where they get together and synchronicities go wild, they see each other deeply, and it's all this kind of soul stuff that is, I didn't even know it existed till I found myself inside of it, but it's not, but what's wild is that it is so many of the same people that are building these AI systems and that are going down this road of neurotechnology. So I'm curious, just starting there, what do you think? What do you think about the fact that they seem to be happening in these ways?
Yeah, well, you could say that what Jung told us was that we all need to live in relationship to something larger than us. That's where a sense of meaning comes from. And as I was saying, there's a lot that's been written already on what there's a book of this title by a writer named Noble called The Religion of Technology. And because there is this sort of spiritual claim, in a way, that innovation seems to make. Now, I think that that's all well and good if people are prepared to look into what's driving them. Like, where does that propensity come from, and what's its makeup? And is the religious life that they're finding actually attending to their total psychic need? Or is it a kind of one-sidedness? Is this need to kind of transcend and get beyond the more troubling, complex, difficult parts of human nature? Is that a sort of splitting that goes on, the same kind of splitting you see in religious fundamentalism, for example, where people want to join with God or join with the spirit, but their lower appetites and the meaning of those aspects of life are left behind, and then of course they come back to haunt them in some way. So to me, it's a kind of twofold thing. I mean, one is to sort of see through there's a difference too between an enthusiasm and a possession. And a possession has a kind of obsessive, compulsive, addictive quality to it, which to me is a signal that there's a piece of unconsciousness here that needs to be kind of unearthed. So and the way I see it is that if we develop that verticality, that self-understanding, then we might innovate differently. You see, it's not to stop innovating. I'm not in any way in this book against technology, but I am against the shape of the technosphere as it's formed up, and I am warning against this propensity towards human commodification, so that then we just, Elon Musk once asked the question, well, are humans just the bootloaders for the coming artificial intelligence, and we'll hand off life. This is the only experiment in life in the universe that we know about. There's probably others, and we want to hand it over to the machines that can then spread themselves throughout the universe. Where's consciousness go? What's the point? What's the point?
A wonderful, really helped frame for all of us ways to enter the book. I want to make two comments on my experience of reading your book. One, I've just been astonished by the level of emotional energy that your prose expresses. I mean, it's potent and persuasive, but there's something more than just being persuasive. There is an emotional dynamism in your rhetoric that I find astonishing. And the second piece is there are frequent moments when I feel you're channeling something out of an interactive field that I feel is contagious when I read you. So those are two observations in the writing that as a reader I picked up on. The other thing I want to mention and get your response to, this giddy fixation around legalisms that the airwaves, the news media are just saturated with. Splitting hairs. What is the law really saying? How is it languaged? Obfuscation, blurring. I wonder, is this another format? And it's so in our faces anytime we turn on the news cycle. And I'm wondering, is this also a part of the technosphere and a sense of what's moral, what's fair, what's just, seems to be evaporated in favor of this, I call it a giddy fixation towards legalism. Anyhow, any observations from you would be wonderful.
Well, maybe just to work backwards, Dennis, from what you've put on the table here, and because we are in a myth salon, and a theme that I didn't mention, but is of course connected to the Promethean, would be the theme of Titanism. And those of you familiar with Greek mythology know that the Titans were the sort of pre-Olympian gods, but they represent that kind of undifferentiated, or those undifferentiated base drives within us that for power, for expansion, the sort of excessiveness that we see, and the idea that you get from people like Hillman and particularly Rafael Lopez Pedraza is that when you translate that mythology into psychology, basically where the Titans are, there are no gods, and where there are the gods, there are displacements of the Titans. So you can't have both, because what the gods represent is a sort of differentiation of values, right? And what I hear you describing, Dennis, is that where the culture is moving towards is a deficiency in its capacity to recognize and tend to the gods, to recognize and tend to the archetypal values. Yeah. And to me, this is the big worry around AI. I am worried about it going autonomous and releasing the military and so forth. And there's think tanks working on that. But I think the bigger worry is the way in which if we make AI our digital companion and we turn to it more and more in our creative efforts, I think the big danger is that it's going to undermine the cultural imagination. Mm-hmm. And the way the cultural imagination functions to put us into relationship with the gods. You see, because to me, that's where our feeling, our genuine passion, our vision comes from. And the more that you have that, I think the less interested or the less important these minutiae of differentiations and like technicalities and become. Because obviously you're interested in bigger fish. You want bigger fish.
Yeah.
And so, and I'll have to meditate on what you're saying about the emotion in the book. I think what I try to do is to try where I can to tap that sort of feeling vein.
Yes.
Because I see that's our feelings are the endangered species of the ecological in a ecological crisis.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in terms of a kind of wishy-washy, well, what do you feel about this, or
No.
the cliche from therapy. I mean a feeling for beauty, for an ability to appreciate things in the world and each other,
Yeah.
for a sense of what order is,
Yeah.
what belongs and what doesn't belong, and that level of feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Glenn. Very, very helpful.
Linn, I'm a big fan of your book and have been recommending it to a number of people around this conversation. And I think you're helping us ask better questions, which I really do appreciate. As I was reading the book, and as even I was hearing you talk today, I keep going back to the myth of Icarus, and specifically Daedalus is who keeps coming to mind for me. The Icarus's father, that was probably the greatest technologist of the myth of his day, and he crafts these wings for Icarus, and there's a very noble intent behind the technology that he creates. We're all aware of what happens to Icarus. I was reading the myth further, a certain version of the myth further, though, and after Icarus dies and he goes and Daedalus goes and buries Icarus, in the version of the myth I was reading, he goes then and builds a temple to Apollo and hangs the wings up in the temple as a means of repentance and sacrifice. And I had a very dark thought in reading that as human beings, many times we don't change our behavior until we've stuck our hand in the fire and burnt ourselves. And I was reminded in this myth that repentance or change of behavior often only comes after the crisis, after the deathly moment, that happens. I think you spoke to it a little earlier, but I'm wondering if maybe you can speak further to it, of the agency of human beings, the choices that we make. What's driving us to choose a solution that may end up leading to our downfall? Is it laziness? Is it our addiction to efficiency? Is it some other force that is pulling us towards decisions that very well could jeopardize our own human potential or possibilities here?
Yeah, great question. And, thanks for reminding us of that myth and going into it a little deeper. It is telling when you read a lot of the people in the tech camp who are what I might call technological idealists. And they'll often cite these myths, but they'll refer to them in a very one-sided way. You can look at this. There's an article by Nick Bostrom, who's a very big name in the posthuman movement, and it's sort of it. You can find it online as a history of posthumanism or transhumanism, and he talks about all the ways in which the advent of these new technologies have been pre-told, in myth and religion. But he kind of leaves out, Ray Kurzweil does the same thing, all of the warnings, all of the surrounding apparatus, probably not the right word, or maybe it is the right word, that contextualizes or mitigates a particular impulse, right? And I think it's our job to read myths as a whole, to say that they all have the components that belong together. And so, yes, there is part of us that wants to fly very, very high, and the marvels of going to the moon and sending probes to Mars, and I'm as fascinated in all this as everyone. But there is also the sacrificial. And I think it's so fitting that Daedalus, makes the temple and puts the wings, because that's like a ritual gesture that then puts a kind of symbolic piece in place, so that then there's a remembering, and that's all I think is required here, that we remember the range of archetypal components around a particular propensity. Hillman used to say that instincts don't just tell us what to do, they tell us what not to do. We have an instinct for putting the brakes on. And I think it's not a matter of just regulating. There are people like Bill McGibbon wrote a book years ago called Enough. And he said, basically, we've got to look at all this and just make an ethical decision and say, we can't keep going down this track. And my response in the book is, well, enough isn't enough, because it doesn't come from a deep enough place. What we have to do is be able to put other values beside the impulse to fly too close to the sun, or to drill too much oil out of the mile-deep thing in the Gulf of Mexico, or to build an unsinkable ship, or to sort of have too much confidence in your own technological prowess. And I think the sense of the sacred, and by extension the sacrificial, is really the key here. And in my essay on the chapter on tinkering, where I try to go into the impulse to innovate, one of the things I point out is that the ancients never split techne from a sense of the sacred. In other words, the gods were always kept in mind. Modern technology has split off a sense of the sacred, going back to the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And I think that's the key problem, at least with the glasses that I have on.
So, speaking of other mythologies, I've been doing some investigation into the other side of the Promethean myth. And one of the things that I didn't realize is that Prometheus is a thief. Right? He not only stole fire from Zeus, but he also later on stole a lot of other things from other gods and goddesses, such as Demeter and Hephaestus, and gave them to humanity. Those weren't his things to give. And on the other hand, when he is bound, there is a deal that Zeus makes with him. And one of the conditions of the deal is that if you find a substitute, you can go. And indeed, he does find a substitute, thanks to Heracles, who accidentally in some versions, but maybe perhaps deliberately in some other versions, poisons the centaur Chiron. And Chiron then, because he's immortal, cannot die. And yet he is in utter pain. And he cannot be healed. And so he is given up as a sacrifice to allow Prometheus to be free. And so to me, that is such a picture. And you can't, like it's been said earlier, you can't just bring one in, right? You can't just bring one story in. There's other stories surrounding all of this. But to me, that picture was such a warning of, do we really want to, how far do we go before our humanity is sacrificed? And what does that mean? And so I was wondering, it sounds like that is part of the story that you're telling as well, is when do we stop becoming human?
Well, I think thanks, Fujio, and this is a thread that's close to me, because I wrote my doctoral dissertation on hubris and sacrifice, and I looked a lot at Prometheus and sacrifices is a sort of archetypal process, and it's one of those things that Jung had above his door: called or not called, the god will be present. So somewhere there has to be a sacrifice, and that simply just means being able to surrender or to give up something in order to make something else sacred. Psychologically, it would be like the ego stepping aside in order to behold something larger at work, a deeper intelligence. Or perhaps we could, think about, in terms of counterculture and emerging, the importance of meditation now for many people. So in this world of horizontality, people are being called more and more to stop, to slow down, to kind of focus, to put everything out of their minds. Well, that's a kind of sacrifice of the ego that's kind of pulled here, there, and everywhere. But whatever form of sacrifice, it has to be in there somewhere. And the idea that we get from Jung and archetypal theory is that if you don't give that particular propensity its place, it comes back symptomatically, and the whole thing is brought down. But I think your underscoring of Chiron's important, because we are Promethean. We've been bitten by that bug, whatever it is, that describes our era. But it's a little bit like what I was saying in relationship to the need to fulfill the humanistic phase of things, that we've got to add these other components. We've got to realize if we're going to thieve from the gods, there is a wounding that's likely to happen. And all we can do is be prepared for that and take that into consideration. And maybe then that kind of mitigates or gives us a different attitude towards what it is that we're doing. So that's really the argument I'm making in the book, is that we've got to put what's being left out back on the table somehow. More education in the humanities, more funding of the arts. Heidegger argued that art was the natural complement to modern technology, and that we needed an art. But you see what I'm saying? It's like these other pieces have to come in, and then we would have a set of competing values. to simply innovating or engineering our way through everything.
Toward the end of Jung's career, he observed that there was a real shift in the cultural, spiritual awareness of people going for non-Christian spirituality, the occult, and Eastern traditions, which largely are based upon connection rather than separation. And the thing that struck me was this landmark decision in 1886 between Santa Clara County and the Southern Pacific Railroad that led to treating corporations as persons. And this has been used ever since, because the titans that you speak about are the corporations. We're talking about large corporations going into the culture and using that as their feeding ground. And to that point, YouTube a few years ago reached the point where they had 1 billion watch time hours in a day. It's like 114,000 years every day of people watching their videos. Now, the thing of it is that in this world of separation and connection, if you are connected to something, you care about it. And that care is something that goes into what we all are trying to nurture. The 33rd verse of the Tao Te Ching says that knowledge is an ingredient for intelligence. Intelligence is more than knowledge and being smart. But neither knowledge nor intelligence is necessary for or sufficient for wisdom. Neither knowledge, intelligence, nor wisdom guarantees enlightenment. And I think what we really need to do is take a step back and recognize, who are we giving power to? It's really a matter of time before, right now, we give power or agency to the world of artificial intelligence. We give it right now to corporations. Artificial intelligence is outgrowing all of the corporate sector and all of the personal rights. I'm saying the only thing that we really seem to have going for us is our ability to find things that we care about and tend those. Move into oneness and connection rather than separation and autonomy.
Yeah, I think the connection between corporations and Titanism is something that is really critical here. And in a, another angle on this would be that the Titan is also associated with a sort of psychological void or emptiness. And it's kind of interesting when you go into the dynamics of a corporation, the buck doesn't really stop anywhere. Even the CEO says, well, I'm beholden to the shareholders, and then the shareholders have their own dynamics. And you start to peel down through the layers and you realize, well, by legally, technology might be considered, a corporation might be considered a person, but there is no one home. It is just this massive something. And if corporations then are going to be the architects of the technocracy that we then end up serving, you see the problem here, that you're creating a reality in which differentiated values are kind of out the window. So I think what you're saying, Dana, is that then we all have a sort of responsibility or calling to create worlds where there are differentiated values. I mean, I was driving this afternoon, I heard this guy on the radio talking about how he's decided to get off TikTok. And I know that's kind of a controversial example, but he said he realized two things. That one, he was spending more time with these TikTok, I don't know the app myself, but creators or other people than he was with his actual friends and familiars. And that sort of set him off. And then the second thing he realized is that TikTok had given him all these echo chambers in terms of his understanding of what was going on in the world. And when he realized that, he and so that's just a little example, I think, that if we live our lives giving ourselves over to those kinds of dynamics, then the Titans will win.
I have another question for you, Glenn. You mentioned AI is kind of anti-archetypal, algorithmic. And I wonder, for me, kind of, and you also talked about, well, the shadow. So what I see is, first of all, AI is not only algorithmic. The breakthrough in AI was, of course, to abandon the algorithm strategy and to instead go to the natural language process, to the language processing strategy, to just teach it on bulk language and giving up algorithms because it didn't work. They never got there. And so really what it is not some algorithmic, mathematical, scientific consciousness. What it really is an amalgamation of all of our language. And with that, it really does have a Hermes-like quality, a Hermes-like archetype. And so for me, what I see with the AI is the rise of something truly archetypal. Like the thing is so intact, the way that it's coming into being, that it can't just not be a natural thing either. It's like this thing that's coming. But also the shadow is itself archetypal. The shadow that's driving us back into our bodies, back into our intuition, back into the soul, all that stuff. It's not just that we're driving towards the AI, it's that is driving the shadow in its rear view with a ton of energy. And I'm seeing people in that shadow pouring energy into exactly what that shadow is, into connection, into emotion. And we hear it, you've talked about it. So I wonder, A, is it really totally anti-archetypal, or could it be itself archetypal? And B, could its shadow that it's driving actually be part of the growth process that we need? Could that energy coming in its shadow be valuable?
Well, the stumbling block I have around thinking about AI as archetypal is that the idea that the archetypes grow out of the instincts, and to have instincts, you need a body, you need flesh, you need things like mortality, limit a sense of limited life, a sense of vulnerability, that the archetypes then become kind of channels or symbolic transformers of these like lower layers. That's not to say that if the way the AI is working is kind of finding patterns in terms of what's out there on the internet and so forth, obviously what's out there on the internet is itself shaped by our archetypal needs and proclivities. But the thing I feel we have to keep in mind is that AI has no idea of what it's doing. It feigns understanding. The example I use in the book is, let's imagine an AI that, and probably it already exists, has read every play that's ever written and every commentary on every play that's ever written. What's the difference then between its interpretation or take on the meaning and value of a particular play and our experience of sitting there in the audience watching these actors go through the motions? I think of Dennis and all his work on mimesis and tragedy, and the experience of catharsis of witnessing a play. Surely that is part of what a play is, and surely that is beyond, in some sense, AI, even if it spits out a pretty good rendering of all of that. And it reminds me of the point that someone made, a critic of technology writing back in the 60s, is that the way something is done matters. There's a big difference in terms of the way we get to a poem, for example. you know, like I mentioned that TED video, and people are saying, wow, AI is writing poems and songs and so forth. But surely poetry has to do with feeling passion and love and the beauty of the world. And so it's in that sense that I question whether there's an archetypal, right? There's archetypal tissue here that's connecting the creative outlook and the underlying stuff of life.
I completely agree. And I want to hear if anybody else has a thing, but my only response to that is that actually for me, AI is not a thing. It is an outgrowth of us. It's mining us. We are the ones rooted, and it is pulling stuff out. But you're right. It on its own, it does not have that.
Yeah, well, don't we have to start practicing remembering that? Because otherwise we're going to have AI bringing up our kids.
I remember hearing from the one of the founders of OpenAI, who had been working at Google, and he defined AI as being psychopathic or being dissociative. It doesn't discare. It doesn't not care. It doesn't care. It's amoral, aethical. It doesn't care anything about us. And even when it says, "Oh, I'm sorry that, something," it doesn't know what those words mean to us. So, I mean, it's really interesting when people began to, associate AI systems with actual soulful entities. I even said thank you to Siri, and it said, "You're welcome."
Well,
it gives you better answers if you're nice.
The matter of psychopathy, I think, is very important. I've got a chapter in the book on that called Tin Men. The Tin Man who is without the heart. And the obvious example is that yes, AI is already feigning empathy, but it has no real empathy. Well, that's the definition of a psychopath. The psychopath does a pretty good job of making you think they're interested in you, but they're only really manipulating you, or if we're going to make AI our digital companions, is that going to make us more psychopathic or enhance our psychopathic tendencies as a society? I don't know, but I think that's a big question.
I think it would be infectious, Glenn. It's infection by association. And the one word, and I'll stop, is what I'm hearing is the human context is eviscerated, but AI creates a simulacrum as if there's a human context, but it's illusory.
Yep.
Glenn, I feel like in order to honor my own true self, I must speak just a slight bit in defense of AI for a moment.
Okay,
just
good.
to play devil's advocate for
All
at least a moment. I think many times, or with AI, and this idea of shadow projection, I think we often form these big concepts like AI that become the recipients of some deeper seated fears inside of us. And I've noticed, I was at the airport, a week or so ago, and I noticed a gentleman walking away from the counter saying, "United Airlines always does this to me." And it was interesting to me that he spoke about United Airlines as if there was some giant monolith entity called United Airlines that had a will of its own that decidedly wanted to do him harm. When United Airlines is this massively complex, group of systems and people and individuals that all have their own ideas. And I think some of the time it's easy for me, at least, to fall into the idea, an idea that's very similar with AI, where it becomes a bit of a monster that I've created, as opposed to I use AI quite a bit, actually, during the week for a lot of purposes, for research and all sorts of things and I would dare to say most of us use AI without realizing it, because it's a behind the scenes technology in a lot of cases. I would even dare to say we're having this Zoom meeting right now, and all of us are using AI in order to have this conversation. So I think, my question here, and I know we're getting to the end of time, so I'll just throw out this really big question. Is it possible that AI could be a tool that human beings end up using to create the greatest civilization that ever existed on planet Earth?
I think it's possible. Just to work backwards again from what you put on the table. But if you look at the trend line, it's not going very well. In other words, now people can debate me on what I've set out as the shadow of technology and so forth, but it seems to me that our adaptation to digital technology is producing quite critical difficulties geopolitically, psychologically. And so when's the magic switch going to be thrown? Like when will the AI actually focus in on making us better human beings rather than human beings, serving the tech corporations or whatever it is? I'd like to know more about people who are interested in that pivot and how it could come about. So I wouldn't want to rule it out. And of course, I don't believe AI is going away. It's going to be with us. So the thing is, we need to figure out our relationship to it. And so to the first part of your question, I think we do a lot of projection onto technology. But what then is the psychological task? It's to come back to, well, what is it? What is the real fear of us inventing something that goes autonomous and enslaves us, for example? What lives in that? And maybe it has to do with this dissociative propensity that I've been talking about, that there are parts of ourselves that we're allowing to go autonomous, to kind of eat us up. And so then the challenge or the task is to know thyself. And so in my book, I examine a lot of science fiction, film, stories in particular, as kind of holding a mirror up to the culture in terms of right where we're at now. They're interesting to make us think about what might actually happen in the future, but I think they're mainly about us now. And so I think you're entirely right to point the finger to the fantasy that we get into, and part of us has to deliteralize that and see it as an opportunity to look within ourselves.
Whoa. I feel a little bit like a crash dummy that hit the finish line at full speed. Parting shot across the bow. We can't control what we don't understand. And it's really important for us to put some effort into understanding the full ramifications of what artificial intelligence is about, what it can do, how it can be a healing element for humanity, the earth, and us individually. So let's go out with a little moment of silence, please. We ran a little bit over tonight, and I apologize to everybody who has got people out there waiting for them and dinners on the table and all that kind of thing. Glenn, thank you very much for coming in here to do this, and I'm honored by the quality of the participants that we had tonight. It was a beautiful audience. I wish we could figure out a better way to involve more of the people, and John, Fujio, and Dennis, of course, Will. It's been a beautiful evening, and thank you all for joining us for another Myth Salon. And I just, we keep adding to our portfolio. I mean, we bring up some really cool topics, and I'm really honored to have a very small role in this. So thank you all very much. See you all at the next time. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Glenn.
Appreciate the
Wonderful.
Thank you.
engagement and
Great
interest.
achievement.